All right, so everybody, I'm going to talk today about the Midwestern Hemp Database and some other university research updates that are currently going on in the region here. Let me get that out of the way. So again, Phillip Alberti, commercial ag educator with University of Illinois. You can find my contact information available here, or it will be available on the last slide that I have. Please reach out anytime. If you have questions about this, you're looking for resources or about anything I'm talking about today, please do not hesitate to reach out. So for some of you, you may be aware of what the Midwestern Hemp Database is. James briefly talked about this. It's a very large-scale research collaborative effort between several land-grant institutions, private labs, and importantly, our grower cooperators across the Midwest. Just generally what we did is we were able to provide discounted cannabinoid sampling and testing for our growers throughout the season in exchange for simple data sharing. And what we do is we put all this information into a repository online that is publicly available, that any grower, any processor, anybody can use to hopefully make some informed decisions about variety selection moving forward. So importantly, we have several sources of data going into the database. We have our general grower submissions. Anybody can contribute to that. We have our university research station trials, which James contributes to, which I myself contribute to, and then the Cultivar Check program, which is a new project this year, which I'm going to share the results of for the first time as well today, James. So I get the feeling it's exciting. And then just I wanted to briefly touch over some other research that's being done by other universities because they're doing great work and it needs to be shared. So for those of you who are not aware, this database here is available online at go.illinois.edu/HempDatabase. And what it allows you to do is pick a source of a genetic, a particular cultivar, perhaps, or cannabinoid of interest. And so, for example, let's just say we look up a very popular variety, Oregon CBD. We select a few of their varieties of which we have information on. And then that data is presented here as both individual data points. So you could see here, for example, this particular sample, it's CBD, THC, CBG, the ratio of those cannabinoids, but also it gives us summary statistics on how those varieties have performed across 2 years in many locations. And so, for example, here you can see for Suver Haze over 2 years, we have 53 samples which were submitted for that particular variety and the data that corresponds to that variety. So it's a great way for you to look up sources of genetics, varieties themselves, cultivars themselves, and also note that these little blue dots here that populate the screen can be clicked on, and it's going to show more information about that particular sample. So some of the information I'm going to talk about is referencing this database as a whole and how we pull in this information. But we've had over 180 grower cooperators over the last 2 years, excuse me. And so we're really excited about the data that we're about to share. So, of course, over 2 years, and I will note that this is more heavily focused on Illinois and Wisconsin than, say, perhaps Michigan, but we've really been able to demonstrate what a typical production season looks like in the Midwest. And granted, you may shift things a little bit, earlier or later, depending on where you are in the Midwest. But for the most part, what we're seeing is an increase in peak transplanting time or into the field in mid to late June. And then we see this kind of peak with flowering practices where varieties begin to flower in mid to late August, in some cases early September, and our harvest period really ramping up in the first and second weeks of October. This just gives you a general idea of the amount of information we've been able to collect over the last few years and how it can be used to help guide production practices. So just a few things that we've gathered over the last few years is that growers are primarily using seed transplants with some clones being used. And a lot of that's being done via transplanting into the field, given that this is a high value crop. Planting into the field is typically around mid-June, but that's going to depend on a few factors that we're going to discuss in a second here. And then irrigation practices are highly variable, but for the most part, growers were not using irrigation on across the larger data set. But what I wanted to point out here is that we finally kind of have some concrete data illustrating Photoperiod and its impact on potential yields. This is some data from North Carolina State, David Suchoff and Maggie Short, who are done some great work over the last few years. And really what they're illustrating is that as we delay planting date into the season, we reduce yields per pound or per plant on a per plant basis for our full season, our photoperiod dependent crops. Why is this important? Well, we have to think about how planting date might interact with, say, something like row spacing, where as we increase the amount of row spacing that we have, we're going to increase the amount of pounds per plant that we can produce. So thinking about how planting date and row spacing and all that is interacting is going to be very important in your overall production system. And just a quick kind of to demonstrate this, while a lot of the information was kind of arbitrary, and kind of anecdotal. Some work from NC State also showed that, typically between 4 to 5 foot spacing per plant is typically going to produce the greatest net returns. However, I like to always point out to growers to think about what works best for them. In my experience, even using upwards of 6 feet has been for row spacing has been beneficial for me and our growers in our system to really allow us to work with the plant, get in, assess issues, pollination, all that. So just some things to consider. Also, this work was just released last month, actually officially publicized via NC State. Illustrating the impacts of nitrogen on CBD hemp. And what they found is that for an economic optimal rate of about 130 pounds of nitrogen was all that a high CBD hemp crop really needed before it started producing a loss, essentially, in terms of biomass. So the economic optimal rate was around 130 pounds per acre. So yield was impacted. However, the data over of their variety trials and of their other nitrogen rate trials also show that nitrogen rate did not significantly impact the amount of cannabinoids that are being produced in the plant. So while we may increase yield via fertility, it's not necessarily having an impact on overall cannabinoid development in a very measurable type way. More research is needed on this, of course, but this is the first real good indicator of this on hemp in the U.S. That I'm aware of. So what am I trying to say here? We need to consider how planting date, how row spacing, planting populations, fertility, and importantly, photoperiod of a specific variety are going to be interacting with one another, right?
Phil, a couple slides back, you need to go back to it, but a couple slides back, it looked like there was a difference between, this one here. So you have white mulch and black mulch here. Is where you also had the difference and show some things?
Yes, I don't want to go into that too much because it wasn't necessarily my study, but you do see an impact perhaps on plastic mulch. This can be due to weed suppression, solarization of the soil. So there's a lot of other factors that I really didn't want to touch too much on. I think the biggest thing, I just didn't want to be, ignorant about it, but I'd say the biggest impact there is how row spacing is going to impact plant development.
Okay.
It's a great question, though. Appreciate it, Blaine.
If anybody has any questions too, while they're watching this, send them in on the chat to us and we'll get them on here. We may go a little longer than 7 o'clock tonight, it looks like. So
I'm going to try to cruise through here. For compliance testing, really too, we're aware of this. We have USDA guidelines, which are illustrated here, showing to take samples from the top 1/3 portion of the plant. But some preliminary work done from the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research, which was cited in the USDA Farm Bill, demonstrates that it's the cannabinoids, especially for THC, are concentrated higher in the top portions of the plant, that apical meristem, and decrease in concentration as you work down the plant. Why is this important? If you're going to be doing sampling, it will behoove you to follow the guidelines, because that is the guidelines that the sampling agents are going to follow, and it will ultimately impact the results that you get where you're sampling from on the plant. So make sure you're following the USDA guidelines for that.
Hey, Phil, I'll say one quick thing about that too. I think you can look at that in terms of remediation strategies as well, right? So the far left there, top 1/3, is what you might test in the field for compliance sampling and analysis. But a remediation strategy of a blended biomass product is coming up about, half, right? And I saw some data at the Science of Hemp conference from another researcher that had actually looked at that aggregated biomass, and they were showing reductions of about 1/3 to 1/2 in THC concentration in that aggregated biomass.
That's a great point, James. Absolutely. So, the samples are can be a little misleading in what you have, and especially in terms of options of trying to remediate that or finding ways to use additional biomass to get those concentrations where they need to be. Absolutely. So I want to move into overview of the data from the database. So this is what the data as a whole looks like here, just without using any of the data filters. And really what I want to point out here is how many variety entries we have for distinct varieties. So for example, cherry wine, there's 84 sample submissions. Silver lining, for example, has 50. So we have a lot of data that's been pulled in here over the last few years. So if you're looking to make variety selections, this would be a great place to look for cannabinoid development, CB to THC ratios, max and mins, things like that. It's all available there. But what I really wanted to say here is that we had over 159 distinct varieties being represented, and there almost 1,400 samples submitted. And I think by the time I actually get through all the data in the next week or so here, we will exceed 1,400 samples. But for now, 1,381. What we found is that over the course of 2 years, 68% of the samples are being submitted through a September through October period of September 8th to October 1st, which is when growers are trying to maximize profitability, which is when flowering is really occurring at the most important rate for a grower. But this can mean that laboratories may be reaching, capacity during these periods. So again, if we think about flowering really happening starting in late August, early September, we start to see samples intake increase dramatically, and that's going to be a concern. So having a good relationship with the laboratory, knowing where and how samples need to be delivered is very important. Also, what I'd like to show over 2 years, we had 402, so 29% of our samples tested above the regulatory threshold for THC. And I remember, James, looking at your presentation, you had a 31% fail rate. So pretty close to what we're seeing over 2 years in the hemp database. And importantly, I'd like to show what has happened here. Previously, the negligence threshold was 0.5% THC. That was increased in the Farm Bill last October to 1%. But you can look here and you can see how many more samples would have failed that negligence threshold previously if it had not been raised to 1%. So pretty important here. So there's a lot of wiggle room in between 5%, 0.5% and 1% in terms of how much CBD can be produced, but it also really gives growers a bit of a blanket here in terms of negligence. But look at this clear-cut relationship. We like to look at relationships as educators, and you can see there's a clear linear relationship between THC and CBD or vice versa. And really what is happening is that as a whole, most of our varieties cannot exceed 0.3%, or are going to exceed 0.3% THC, and they're going to do so at about 8% CBD, 8 to 9% CBD, which comes into, again, it's this relationship, right? And it's a relationship between CBD to THC of about 26 to 1, which is what you end up seeing promoted as kind of a metric for success is CBD to THC. And I'm going to talk more about why that's very important here and how it may be useful to you, but just something to keep in mind over 2 years of data, a very clear relationship. This is seconded from some work shared by Doris Hamilton from Kentucky, who runs the hemp program. You can just see that, over in 2019, 43% of their samples tested above 0.3% THC. So it's a problem everywhere. So for our CBD dominant cultivars, they're exhibiting this nice curve linear or linear relationship. And typically total CBD, again, is not able to exceed 8% without exceeding 0.3% THC. This CBD to THC ratio of about 20 to 30 to 1 or 25 to 1 will help maintain profitability for growers looking to utilize this value. And it's important to know that all varieties are not created equal and must be compared separately. We put a report of high potential varieties out last year, and we're going to do that again this year. But this is just some information I wanted to share. So again, this is just demonstrating that clear relationship between CBD and THC, and that for the most part, we're looking at between about 25 to 1 as a good CBD to THC ratio, or north of that, even 30 to 1 to maximize profitability while maintaining compliance late in the season. So work done from Cornell University supports this as a whole. So I always like to back up what we're doing with our large scale data collection with what's being done by other university research trials to just strengthen what we're trying to do here. And so Cornell showed that most of the varieties in their trials tested between 20 to 1 and 30 to 1. And interestingly enough, didn't really see impacts of CBD to THC ratios, not production of these cannabinoids, but their ratios, not a difference by site. So environment, location, stable genetics, we're typically going to produce the same or similar CBD to THC ratios across environments. The amount of those cannabinoids can change depending on production practices and the environment, but the ratios are fairly stable. So why is that important? Because it means that all the samples collected throughout the database can be kind of aggregated together, and we can feel confident that we're making educated decisions. So when looking at varieties entered into the database, we look at the record count, their CBD to THC average, but also we can look at this ratio here, which gives us an idea. And again, we're looking between 25 and 30 to 1. It's kind of that targeted area, but we've had some entries that have even exceeded that, which is pretty impressive. Yeah. Impact on final rules. James talks about the collaboration. This is a truly collaborative effort. We're so proud of the work that we've been able to do together over the last couple of years. And importantly, data from the database was used to impact the USDA final ruling last year, because we were able to submit data as it was coming in from our growers to write a report, which impacted THC testing windows, the negligence threshold, harvest windows, and exemptions for research. So it's pretty important stuff that we're trying to do, and we're going to hope to continue to use this information to impact policy moving forward where applicable. So just a quick thing, I wanted to note that, here in Illinois, we kind of found our own rules. We are technically in kind of a status of limbo. And if you are an Illinois grower, for at least the time being, if you need to get an Illinois license, you'll have to go through the USDA while the current hemp rules are being approved in the review process for approval. So just keep that in mind. All right, so last thing I'm going to talk about is the Cultivar Check program, which was kind of the child of the hemp database. We wrote a grant and we received SARE funding from the Sustainable Agriculture and Research and Education to do the partnership grant. We took several of the best cultivars or varieties from the 2020 growing season based on select criteria that we liked and that we could agree upon as a collective unit, as a research collective. And then we reached out to the seed companies to provide us with these genetics for us to send to growers free of charge that we could test via the SARE funding. So you'll note that I've had to block out one here due to material transfer agreements. I'm not sure if I can share their data quite yet, but these other ones I can talk about freely. So pretty important to note, we had the varieties. This is the number of locations that they were tested in and the number of sample submissions for each variety in total. So a very large amount of samples we were able to collect across this data set. And it's important to note that at each location for each variety, we tested 3 times, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and 7 weeks after flowering. And this coincided with university station trials that we were conducting. Importantly, samples were analyzed twice by 2 partnering labs, and then the data on agronomic performance was collected as well. And our goals are really just to create a list of recommended varieties for the region. So here in all these blue sites are where we sent the seeds to. We tried to essentially randomize so the varieties were well represented across the regions, and this is what we came up with. So what we had is at each location, the data was at each location, samples were submitted at 3, 5, and 7 weeks after flowering. And what we saw across our trials as well was that across the aggregate, that across flowering periods as well, that the CBD THC ratios were not impacted. So what we saw in our trial was that, across flowering periods, the CBD to THC ratio was not significantly impacted. And this again supports the research being done by Cornell looking at differences in environmental conditions that have no significant difference in CBD to THC, and again by site. So what we did is we had the samples be sent to one lab, and then they were sent to another. And due to proficiency testing among the labs, we felt that we could take the average across both lab samples because we really wanted to, in the spirit of the hemp database, combine as much information as possible. And we were able to come up with basically this. All right, so we have a variety, we have its expected flowering in the Midwest using the data from our growers. And then we have the number of, the timing when the sample was taken, the number of samples at that time point, and then the total average for those values. For CBD, CBG, and THC, as well as the average CBD to THC ratios for those varieties across all time points. So what did we find here? We have a combo chart, and in our blue, or in the histograms here, is the CBD represented on the left, and on the right, represented by these lines here, is our THC. So for example, this green here is the Suver Haze variety for CBD at 3 time points, and this green line represents the THC at those 3 time points. And what did we find? We found that likely most of the varieties that we put into our trial were going to exceed that regulatory threshold of 0.3% THC by week 7, if not before then, in weeks between weeks 5 and 7, at some point in here, really. So this is suggesting that even going 5, 6, 7 weeks is starting to push it for a lot of these varieties, and they need to be tested early and often to ensure compliance.
That's after flowering?
After flowering initiation.
Flowering, okay. Oh yeah, it says right there. Okay, thank you.
So this very importantly, it was pretty exciting to see the results of this. So again, you can look at how each of these varieties are performing from CBD and THC standpoints. But think about too, is maybe if it's a producer like Suver Haze, which racks up CBD and THC very quickly, that you may be able to harvest it earlier, at an earlier time before it reaches that level when conditions may be more conducive for you. So thinking about production practices, thinking about variety performance, compliance testing, how they all kind of form together into this whole picture of what it means to be a hemp grower.
The conversation today too about disease, the longer that plant's in the field, way more risk for disease, infection and development. So that's really useful.
Absolutely, James. And I'm glad you said that, because I wanted to look across the cultivar check program and see what was happening to these THC ratios over time. And you and I have discussed this before too, that maybe even 7 weeks is too late, where we have degradation or dilution of these compounds over time. And that maybe even earlier on, to maximize the effectiveness of the plant, we're looking at an earlier harvest in that week 5, week 6, potentially, maybe even earlier, depending on the variety. But what I thought was very interesting was across many of the varieties as a whole, even into week 7, we started to see a breakdown in this production. So this data was also supported by work done by our University of Illinois replicated trial, and due to NDAs, cannot share the names of some of these varieties yet. But what you're really seeing here is that the CBD to THC ratios are staying in this 20 to 30 range throughout flowering for all of our CBD dominant varieties, or pretty close. This one's a little short, but it's staying in that range. And again, it's throughout flowering and throughout environments. So it's really about stability of the genetics. And then one of the things that I've really found interesting is looking at our CBG dominant cultivars. And I'm going to be wrapping up here in just a moment. What I found very interesting was that not for a single sample across any of the locations or any of the time points did any of our CBG dominant varieties exceed the regulatory threshold for THC. This agreed with the work that we saw from the Midwestern Hemp Database last year, and that may be an opportunity for growers to minimize issues with compliance is by growing a variety that does not produce it in those high amounts. So we can see that both these varieties produced, 9% or north of 9% for CBG, but none of them exceeded the amount of THC for compliant varieties. Pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, that's good.
So universities out there who are trying to do research and have to convince people to do this work and not have to go with compliant hemp that's going to be non-compliant, I've been pushing them towards CBG dominant varieties because it minimizes the risk a little bit if you're looking to do some easy research type production.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last thing I want to talk about real quick is just day neutral and photoperiod dependent differences in plant growth. Differences in the seeding rate, but I wanted to use some information from James's trials that he published last year that's available currently online to just demonstrate to you that strip biomass for photoperiod dependent versus day neutral type varieties is going to be tremendously different, and how that factors into your production system. Seeding rates are going to be much different, and just when you're harvesting, but also keep in mind, the hemp database is useful for cannabinoid development, but when you're looking at variety performance for a region, look to your university station trials. For yield, look to them to get a more accurate representation of what's going to happen in your field. So we can look at performance and yield metrics with our variety trials, and then use the hemp database for cannabinoid development, merge the two together, and come up with an educated guess on what the best varieties are going to be for you. Again, this is work that James has illustrated. This is work from Shelby Ellison from UW-Madison, also published and available online, showing differences in flowering initiation and flowering across a particular variety. So again, we're combining yield, we're combining flowering dates and flowering ranges, looking for varieties that have tighter flowering windows to minimize issues with compliance potentially and harvest down the line, combining all this data from all of the work that we're doing together to try to make a good guess on which you're going to grow. So I really want to point out that this is, we have our grain fiber trials from the University of Illinois, and those are available here. We have 2 years of data, 2020 and 2021, and we had 30 varieties in our grain fiber trial this last year. And we also have a great YouTube video available showing the whole trial from start to finish, and that is also available here. You can use either the QR codes or just use the links below, and that'll get you there. And the last thing I'm going to say is this has truly been a collaborative effort between all of us, from the Midwestern Hemp Database and the Midwestern Hemp Collaborative, to our growers, to our private sponsors, for SARE for funding this project. And I get a kick out of it when I think that James and I still haven't met, and that we started this thing over Zoom when the pandemic started, and our group of collaborators has still been meeting regularly, and this is just how we're doing things now. So hopefully one day I'll get to shake your hand, James, but for the time being, it's been great to work with you on these projects, and I look forward to continuing and doing that. So with that, I will take any questions that you have.
Well, Phil, we'll make that happen in May. How does that sound?
Oh, looks great.
You come to the expo and that'll happen. So
I'll be there.
Dave, have we got any questions that have come in online from anything?
No, but I can, if anyone, we have some attendees on Zoom, so if anyone wants to raise their hand, they can